The vital sign. You learn, in 30 years of ICU nursing, that deterioration rarely announces itself the way television makes you expect. There's no dramatic monitor alarm blaring the moment something goes wrong. There's a respiratory rate that climbs by 2 breaths a minute, quietly, over 4 hours. There's a patient who seems a little more tired than they were on the last round, in a way that could mean anything or nothing. You learn to read the accumulation of small things, because by the time the big alarm sounds, you've usually already lost the hour that mattered most. My name is Renata Cole. I've been an ICU nurse for 31 years, the last 14 as charge nurse of the Medical Intensive Care Unit at Ashford General. This is a story about the week I nearly missed exactly the kind of quiet deterioration I've spent 3 decades training myself to catch, not because I stopped caring, and not because I trusted a machine too much or too little, but because my attention was somewhere else entirely, in a nursing home 200 miles away, with my mother. Ashford General installed a predictive deterioration monitoring system called VitalWatch 14 months before this story starts, an AI platform that continuously analyzed vital sign trends, lab values, and nursing documentation across every ICU patient, generating an early warning score designed to flag clinical deterioration hours before it became obvious to the naked eye: sepsis, respiratory failure, cardiac decompensation, the kind of slow-building crises that, caught early, are almost always survivable, and caught late, almost never are. The system was championed by Dr. Priyanka Shah, the hospital's newly appointed Chief Clinical Innovation Officer, a woman I'd trained as a resident 12 years earlier, back when she was a nervous 28-year-old who used to find me at 3 in the morning to ask questions she was too proud to ask her attending. I was proud of her, the way you're proud of anyone you've watched grow into real competence, and I want to say clearly that most of what happened between us that year wasn't personal in the way it might have been with a stranger. It was harder than that, in some ways, precisely because it wasn't. VitalWatch isn't replacing nursing judgment, Renata, she told me, in the weeks before full deployment, the two of us standing in the unit's break room the way we used to stand there when she was still learning the job under my direct supervision. It's catching the trends that build slowly enough that even good nurses, on a hard shift, might not connect until later than we'd want. I've caught every deterioration on this unit for 31 years without an algorithm telling me the trend line looks concerning. I know you have. I'm not questioning that. I'm asking you to consider that 31 years of vigilance is exhausting to sustain every single shift, for every single nurse on this floor, and that a system watching continuously might catch the one moment even the best of us happens to be looking somewhere else. I didn't have a strong answer to that, at the time, beyond a general institutional wariness that I think a lot of experienced clinicians carry toward algorithmic early warning scores, a wariness rooted in years of watching hospitals adopt scoring systems that generated so many false alerts nurses eventually learned to click through them without reading. The exact problem I'd later hear an offshore drilling supervisor describe to me at a conference, in almost identical language, about an entirely different industry entirely. I'd sat through 2 previous rollouts of similar predictive tools in my career, both eventually quietly abandoned after nurses stopped trusting their alerts within a year, and I told Priya as much, more bluntly than I probably needed to. I've watched 2 of these systems come and go already, Priya. Both times, the alerts fired so often on patients who were perfectly fine that the whole unit learned to ignore them within 6 months. I don't want a third version of that same experiment on my floor. This one's validated differently, Renata. The false positive rate in the pilot data is under 8%, weighted specifically against sepsis and respiratory decompensation patterns. I know that doesn't erase the history you're describing. I'm asking you to let this one earn your trust on its own data, not the data from systems that came before it. I agreed, mostly because refusing outright would have meant overriding a decision that had already cleared the hospital's Clinical Governance Committee, a body I sat on myself and had, somewhat reluctantly, voted to approve. What I didn't anticipate, and what neither Priya nor I could have predicted, was that the moment VitalWatch would matter most in my own unit would have nothing to do with the system's reliability at all, and everything to do with where my own attention happened to be that particular week. My mother, Josephine, had been living in a memory care facility outside the small town where I grew up for the better part of 3 years, her dementia progressing slowly enough that I'd convinced myself, for most of that time, that I had a reasonable handle on managing her care from 200 miles away, coordinating with facility staff over phone calls I usually took during my own breaks at the nurses' station. I'd built an entire private system for managing that distance, a folder of facility contact numbers, a standing Sunday phone call, a mental ledger of which staff members actually called me back promptly and which ones I needed to follow up with twice, the same instinct for building reliable systems out of unreliable pieces that had made me good at this job for 3 decades, applied now to a part of my life where no amount of good systems could actually slow down what was happening to her. The week this story turns on, the facility called me twice in 4 days to report that my mother had stopped eating consistently, was sleeping most of the day, and had grown confused in ways that seemed, even to a staff used to dementia's unpredictable course, meaningfully different from her baseline. I made those calls from the ICU break room, in 6-minute windows between patients, trying to make decisions about a hospice consultation and a possible facility transfer while an entire unit of critically ill patients waited for me 40 feet away. I remember the specific, physical sensation of walking back onto the floor after each of those calls, forcing my face into the composed, competent expression my patients and staff needed to see, while some other part of me was still standing in a hallway 200 miles away that I couldn't actually be in. I want to be honest about what that week actually felt like, because I think the honesty matters more than the professional distance I might otherwise be tempted to put around it. I was exhausted in a way that had nothing to do with shift length, carrying a specific, low-grade dread every time my phone buzzed, distracted during rounds in small ways I noticed and dismissed as manageable, the way I imagine every experienced clinician convinces themselves their private life isn't actually affecting their clinical attention, right up until it does. Mr. Emmett Haversham was a 67-year-old man admitted 4 days earlier with community-acquired pneumonia, responding well to treatment by every measure I'd charted on my Tuesday morning assessment, clear lung sounds improving, oxygen requirements decreasing, appetite returning, the kind of steady recovery trajectory that, on a normal week, I'd have felt genuinely good about walking away from at shift change. He was a retired schoolteacher, quick with a joke even short of breath, the kind of patient whose recovery you find yourself rooting for a little more than the job strictly requires. What I didn't fully register, on that Tuesday assessment, was a respiratory rate that had climbed from 16 to 19 breaths per minute over the preceding 6 hours, a subtle shift I'd normally have flagged automatically, the kind of number that lives in the specific category of clinical detail I've built 31 years of professional identity around never missing. I noted it in his chart, in the same careful handwriting I'd used for 3 decades, and moved on to my next patient without the small pause I'd normally have given that number, the pause where you actually sit with a trend instead of simply recording it. I did not, if I'm honest with myself now, sit with it the way I would have on a week when my attention wasn't halfway to a memory care facility 200 miles away. VitalWatch flagged Mr. Haversham's early warning score as elevated at 2:40 p.m. that same Tuesday, a full 3 hours before his condition would have become clinically obvious to a bedside assessment alone, the system's algorithm weighing the respiratory rate trend alongside a slight elevation in his white blood cell count and a subtle drop in his oxygen saturation that, individually, might each have seemed within normal variation, but together, in the pattern the model had been trained to recognize, suggested an early secondary infection developing underneath his improving pneumonia. I saw the alert on my workstation screen at 2:47 p.m., 7 minutes after it fired, in the middle of taking a phone call from my mother's facility about whether to authorize a swallow study given her increasing difficulty with food. I remember glancing at the VitalWatch notification, registering it as one more item in a stack of things demanding my attention that I didn't have the emotional bandwidth to fully process in that moment, and setting it aside mentally with something close to, though not quite, the same dismissive reflex I'd have used for a false alarm, except this alert wasn't false, and some part of me, even distracted, must have registered that difference, because I didn't fully forget about it. I simply didn't act on it with the urgency it actually required. I finished the phone call with my mother's facility at 3:15 p.m., authorized the swallow study, and sat for a moment at the nurse's station with my hands pressed flat against the counter, doing the specific, private work of pushing one crisis back down far enough to be present for the next one, a skill every experienced nurse develops, And one I'd never before had to deploy against something as personally consuming as watching my own mother decline from a state I couldn't do anything meaningful about from 200 miles away. It was Priya, not the alert itself, who ultimately moved me to act. She was rounding on the unit that afternoon, part of VitalWatch's ongoing validation protocol that had her personally reviewing flagged cases alongside bedside nursing staff, and she stopped at my station specifically to ask about Mr. Haversham's elevated score. His vitals looked reassuring on this morning's assessment, Renata. What's your read on the trend since? I want to describe honestly what happened in my own mind in that moment, because I think it's the most important few seconds in this entire story. I could have told her, truthfully, that I'd seen the alert and hadn't yet had the capacity to act on it, and I could have felt, in saying that, the specific shame of admitting that my own attention had genuinely lapsed on a patient under my direct care, a shame made sharper by the fact that I was admitting it to a woman I'd once taught, in this exact unit, never to let that happen. Instead, something in her direct, unhurried question cut through the fog I'd been operating in for 4 days, and I actually looked, really looked, at Mr. Haversham's full trend line for the first time since the alert had fired. The respiratory rate climb was real. The oxygen saturation drift was real. Combined with a repeat blood draw I ordered within the hour, showing a white count now unmistakably rising, the picture resolved into something I would have caught on any other week within 20 minutes of his first subtle change, and had instead taken most of an afternoon, and a colleague's direct question, to finally see clearly. We started him on broader antibiotic coverage by 4:30 p.m., 3.5 hours after VitalWatch's initial flag, catching a secondary bacterial infection early enough that his subsequent course, while serious, never progressed to the kind of septic decompensation that a longer delay would very likely have produced. He recovered fully over the following 10 days, discharged home with his original pneumonia and its secondary complication both resolved, a good outcome by any clinical measure, and one that came closer to not being a good outcome than I've ever been fully comfortable admitting. Priya found me at the end of that shift, in the same break room where we'd first discussed VitalWatch months earlier, and I told her the truth, because I'd spent 31 years believing that honesty about a clinical near-miss was the only thing that actually kept a unit safe over the long run. I saw the alert at 2:47. I didn't act on it the way I should have until you asked me directly at 3:15. That's on me, not on the system, and not on you. What was happening at 2:47, Renata? I told her about my mother, about the facility calls, about 4 days of trying to hold together a professional life and a personal crisis using the same finite reserve of attention I'd always assumed, incorrectly, was somehow separable by force of will alone. She listened the way she used to listen as a resident, fully, without rushing to reassure me before I'd finished saying the harder parts out loud. The system caught what you couldn't catch that particular afternoon, she said, finally. That's not an indictment of you. That's exactly the scenario VitalWatch was built for, not because nurses like you are unreliable, but because you're human, carrying things the rest of us don't always see, on weeks when even the best clinical judgment in this hospital has somewhere else it needs to be. I spent months resisting this system because I didn't want to believe there was a version of me distracted enough to need it. I spent 12 years believing there was a version of you that never needed anything, Renata. I don't think either of those beliefs was ever quite true. My mother died 11 weeks later, in the memory care facility, with hospice support I'd finally authorized properly instead of managing in 6-minute phone windows between patients. I took the leave I needed for her final days, something I don't think I'd have given myself permission to do as easily a year earlier, before Mr. Haversham's afternoon taught me something about the actual cost of believing my own attention could be infinitely divided without consequence. I still distrust algorithmic scoring systems in the general, professional way I think most experienced clinicians reasonably should. I've seen enough false alerts, enough poorly validated models, to know that skepticism isn't the same thing as arrogance. But I no longer believe, the way I did before that Tuesday afternoon, that 31 years of vigilance makes a person immune to the specific, human cost of carrying more than any one person should have to carry alone during a single shift. VitalWatch still runs on my unit, refined now with additional validation from cases exactly like Mr. Haversham's, and I still review its flags myself, every shift, the same careful cross-check I'd have insisted on regardless of what the system's accuracy statistics eventually proved. What changed isn't my clinical judgment. It's my willingness to admit, out loud, to a colleague, that the judgment I've spent a career being trusted for has limits I used to be too proud to name, limits that a good system, built by someone who once trusted me enough to learn everything she knows from watching how I worked, was actually built to catch. Deterioration still doesn't announce itself dramatically, most of the time. It arrives in small increments, easy to miss on an ordinary week, and considerably easier to miss on a week when you're quietly carrying something no monitor on this unit was ever built to measure. I've learned, since that Tuesday, that the two kinds of attention in this hospital, the kind a machine sustains without fatigue, and the kind a human being brings alongside everything else they're carrying that nobody else can see, were never actually in competition. They were only ever supposed to be looking out for each other, on the exact weeks either one of them might not be enough alone.